Welcome to our topic on diffusion. This is going to be a short video explaining the three things that you need to know about diffusion. First of all, what it is. Secondly, how it works. And thirdly, being able to apply some biological examples to it for the exam. First of all, you can see on this diagram that there is a cell, and you can see that inside and outside the cell there are some particles or molecules. It doesn't matter what these particles or molecules actually are, because diffusion can happen to any particle or molecule as long as it's small enough and as long as it's in a gas or it's dissolved in a liquid, in a solution. Now you'll find that this is very common in biology because there are an awful lot of molecules or particles that are moving into cells or out of cells because they are dissolved into a liquid, into a solution. So that's the most common type of diffusion in biology, is diffusion of substances that are dissolved in liquids, and the liquids are either in the cell or surrounding the cell. Right, the next thing we need to look at is the distribution of these particles. Now, as you can see from this diagram, there are far more particles inside the cell than there are outside of the cell. And what that means is we have something called a concentration gradient. The concentration of these green particles is much higher in the cell than it is surrounding the cell. And that means that diffusion will take place, because diffusion is the movement of particles from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So, if we had to draw an arrow on this diagram to show the direction that the molecule is diffused in, I would hope that you would draw an arrow from inside the cell to outside the cell, because the particles move from high concentration to low concentration. Right, if we look at this diagram, this is a magnified, zoomed in version of part of the cell membrane that we were looking at just before. We can still see that on the left hand side, inside the cell, there is the higher concentration of particles, and on the outside, on the right, the lower concentration of particles. And we can now see that actually the cell membrane represents a kind of a sieve-like structure. There are little holes in it, small enough to allow these tiny particles to be able to move from one side to the other. And this is how they manage to get across that cell membrane. The cell membrane controls entry and exit of substances, and these molecules, being small enough to fit through these tiny gaps, are able to move from one side to the other, depending on which side has the higher concentration. It's important to remember here, our definition of diffusion is the movement of molecules or particles from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, and we can see that happening here quite clearly. It's moving from the left, where the concentration is higher, to the right, outside the cell, where the concentration is lower. Here are another couple of diagrams representing the same cell membrane structure. And this is something else that we need to understand about diffusion, is that although it moves from a high concentration of particles to a low concentration of particles, the steepness of the concentration gradient also has an effect on how fast diffusion takes place. Now, if you look at the diagram on the top left here, can you see that there is actually a very big difference in the two concentrations on the left and the right side of the membrane? On the left hand side of the membrane, a very high concentration of particles, and on the right there are very few. So that concentration gradient is very steep. On the right hand side diagram, over at the top right, there's not much difference between the concentrations there, but if you counted up the number of particles on the left and the right, you would still see that there is a concentration gradient. It's just that the steepness of that gradient is far less in comparison to the first one we looked at. So we can say that diffusion will happen much quicker where there's a steep concentration gradient, and diffusion will still happen but at a much slower rate where the concentration difference is not so big, like in the diagram on the right. It's really important at GCSE to understand this concept of rate. Rate of movement of molecules by diffusion here means how many molecules are moving overall from one side of the membrane to the other side of the membrane per second, per minute, per hour. So it's the number of molecules moving in a certain unit of time. So let's summarise diffusion then. Here in red it says it's the movement of particles in a gas or dissolved in a liquid from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. In addition to that, we know that the steepness of that concentration gradient is going to make a difference to how fast diffusion takes place. The steeper the concentration gradient, the faster the molecules will move by diffusion. And then we've also got some examples here of 3 molecules that will be the most common ones you will be asked about on the GCSE exam. The fact that oxygen is going to be moving into cells by diffusion, carbon dioxide is going to be moving out of cells by diffusion, and glucose is going to also be moving into cells by diffusion. Now, if we think about those 3 in particular, why they need to be moving and which way they're moving, it's really obvious. Oxygen and glucose are both required by the body cells, for the process of respiration, where the glucose is converted using oxygen into an energy form that the body's cells can use. And the carbon dioxide is the waste product from that. So the carbon dioxide is going to be produced by the cells and needs to be got rid of. Now, I'm sure you can see straight away that in order for oxygen and glucose to diffuse into a cell, they will need to be in a high concentration outside of the cell so that diffusion will take place down the concentration gradient into the cell. And vice versa for carbon dioxide, it needs to be in a high concentration inside the cell, having just been produced, and it will therefore then diffuse out of the cell from the high concentration inside to the low concentration outside, and that's how we remove carbon dioxide from our cells as a waste product. It's also worth a quick mention here about how oxygen and glucose actually get to the body cells. You know from year 8 that they're being delivered by the bloodstream, so you need to think about where that oxygen came from. It comes into the body, you breathe it in the air that you breathe into your lungs, and then the oxygen molecules will actually diffuse from inside your lungs in the alveoli into the bloodstream. Now that tells us something. If we know that oxygen is diffusing from inside the alveoli into the blood in your bloodstream, then it must be in a higher concentration in the alveoli than it is in the bloodstream, because it's moving from a high concentration to a low concentration. And the same can be said for the glucose, which comes in the food that you eat. You digest it and then it moves across from inside your small intestine into your bloodstream, and we know it diffuses, so it must be in a higher concentration in your small intestine than it is in your bloodstream, because we know that it moves from high to low concentration. Now, we'll look at this process in more detail in class, but it's worth being aware before you get to class that these are the really key things that they could be asking you about on the exam. Okay, so let's summarise diffusion then. First of all, what exactly is diffusion? The movement of particles in a gas or dissolved in a liquid from an area of high concentration to an area of lower concentration. Then we need to consider what factors will affect the rate of diffusion, and we know that the concentration gradient will affect the rate of diffusion. Now, temperature also affects rate of diffusion, but in living things, temperatures tend to be fairly constant. It's not like in chemistry where you can heat it up and make it go faster. If you get too hot, you'll die. So really for us, it's the concentration gradient. The steeper the concentration gradient, the faster the rate of diffusion. Finally, we need to remember the important biological molecules, the ones that they could ask us about on the exam, and the 3 most important ones for diffusion in cells are oxygen, glucose, and carbon dioxide. So remember which way they move, whether they're needed by the cell. If they're needed by the cell, they need to be coming into the cell. And in order to come into the cell, they need to be coming from a high concentration outside to a lower concentration inside. Whereas if they need to be removed from the cell, then they'll be in a high concentration inside the cell and a low concentration outside the cell. And we'll practice in class some questions to go with that.